Welcome, welcome everyone to the last of our social justice lecture series this year. Our final presenter is Ms. Veronica Eady. Before I do her full introduction, I just want to remind us, like any community here in Vallejo, we have a strong history and diversity from the contributions of so many that is important to honor and remember. So as we begin, before this event, I want to take a moment to remind us that we're here on the place of traditional Miwok land and that we recognize their stewardship of this area for generations. And then our dean is going to step forward. She has a few words to say, and then I'll do Ms. Eady's introduction.
Hello again. Welcome. So exciting. This is our last of the public social justice series on environmental justice. So we're really excited to host this once again. And I'm Dr. Lisa Norton, so I'm the Dean of the College of Educational Sciences. I know our students have heard me say that many times. I want to just welcome you and let you know that since social justice is near and dear to our hearts, I think it's really important to recognize that we open this up to the community and allow our community members to join us as part of the free lecture series and can also join us on Zoom. With that said, if any of you in the community or even students are interested in actually donating money for diversity scholarships for our social justice fellows who actually help us put these events on and help us come up with discussion questions, feel free to see me afterwards and we're happy to talk, or I can send you a link, a follow-up link. It really helps the university be able to kind of offer the program we do and really ultimately support more public health students that are going to go in the world and have social justice oriented practice. So the other thing I want to recognize is it is Veterans Day today. So I want you all to please remember those probably in your family or those yourself. Are there any veterans in the room or military, active military? Okay, thank you so much for your service. Want to recognize this is Veterans Day. And we did have a ceremony today at noon, which was really moving for us. The last thing I do want to say that we do have different presenters as part of our social justice series. They don't necessarily represent all the opinions of everybody at Toro, but we're really excited to open up discussions on hard topics, to really talk and dialogue with our students and talk about what to expect as a healthcare professional and recognize our amazing speakers that come to us with so much diverse and interesting experiences and work that they do, because we really know there is environmental problems in this country. We just experienced massive fires, power outages. It actually almost reached my home, affected my work. So we know these things are tied together. So it's extremely important work that you're doing, and we appreciate you being here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Mackey introduce our speaker and welcome you tonight. And thank you so much for being here. And we will be following up with you all and continue to invite you to our events on campus. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Norton. So I'll also just put a quick reminder for those of you who came in a little late and didn't hear Sharon's reminder. The survey that you got at the beginning, we're doing the follow-up today. So after this presentation, if you could fill that out and leave your completed survey in the box at the front of the room. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Veronica Eady is the Assistant Executive Officer currently of the California Air Resources Board, and she's responsible there for overseeing environmental justice activities of the board. Formerly, Ms. Eady was the Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation of Massachusetts and was the Associate General Counsel and Director of Environmental Justice at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, a nonprofit civil rights firm in New York City. Ms. Eady served as Director of the Environmental Justice and Brownfields Program for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, where she was the principal author of the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Policy. Additionally, Ms. Eady has served as Executive Director of Alternatives for Community and Environment, an environmental justice advocacy organization. She's the former chair of EPA's Federal Advisory Committee for Environmental Justice and the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and she's held appointments on several faculties, including the Europe Viadriana University in Germany and Tufts University in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning. I want to welcome warmly, thank you so much, to Ms. Veronica Eady.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. I see my friends. Hello, friends from the community who came here to see me. I'll say more about them later. First, let me start off by thanking you all for being here on Veterans Day. And I want to take an opportunity just to recognize my late father, Veronica Eady, who served in the Korean War, and my beloved, beloved late cousin, Malcolm Eady, who flew B-52 bombers in the Vietnam War and retired as a lieutenant colonel of the Air Force. As I was thinking about coming here today, I was thinking about them in particular. But how many people, are you all familiar with the California Air Resources Board? How many people know what CARB is? Okay, some of you. So the California Air Resources Board is an air quality agency. I live in Sacramento, so we're headquartered in Sacramento. We work on air quality issues pertaining to mobile sources, so cars and trucks and gasoline fuels. We're responsible for regulating consumer products. So furniture that is off-gassing or carpeting, things like that. And we're also responsible for regulating greenhouse gases. California is unique in that there are 35 local air districts, and you're sitting right now in the footprint of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. They're responsible for stationary sources, so factories and cement kilns and refineries. And we work very closely together. To orient you to the Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, our big, most recent, I guess, claim to fame is that it was our engineers who discovered the Volkswagen cheat device that affected 8 million Volkswagen cars around the world. So we're responsible for that. We're also responsible for, if you have a car, it has a check engine light, we're to blame for that. So we try to make sure that cars that are sold do what they're supposed to do and meet the tailpipe standards that we set. So that's CARB. CARB has been around for 51 years. I came to work for CARB in March of 2017, so not that long ago. And I was the first ever executive level position to do environmental justice work. Okay, I'm going to see if this works. So this is me, Veronica Eady, Assistant Executive Officer for Environmental Justice. And you heard a little bit about my career. I've been sort of globetrotting all over the world, but I started when I was 18. I moved to California, did my undergraduate degree in LA at the University of Southern California, and graduated from law school in San Francisco and Hastings. So I lived for 16 years in California before moving to the East Coast. Did some of the things that you heard, was in Boston. It's actually where I came from most recently. I have literally lived all over the world. So I did live in Germany where I taught in a human rights and humanitarian program at Europe Viadriana University, which is on the border with Poland. And I also lived in Russia briefly, in Siberia, where I helped set up the first environmental law clinic in the Russian Federation. And now I'm here. I like to start by humbling myself a little bit. So this is my 4th grade picture. And I included my 4th grade picture because really is who I am. And I want to tell you a little bit about my background. So I am the youngest of 7 children. My father supported us all. He was a sanitation worker. He worked on a garbage truck. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and my father, our town had one garbage truck, and my father was not allowed to be the driver on that truck because he was black. So until he was 65 years old, he jumped up and down off of the truck hoisting the garbage cans of my town. This is my town, Elwood City, Pennsylvania. There it is, the red splotch on Pennsylvania. So we're pretty much Appalachia. The tri-state area there is Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, and we did refer to ourselves as a tri-state area. My town was a rural town of about 7,500 people. Less than 1% were people of color, and when I was growing up, people of color meant black, and there were two big families of 7 kids, and most of the people were related to one of those families. When I graduated from high school, I had 3 other African American students in my graduating class, but I graduated on time and they did not graduate on time. So had they not graduated on time, I would have been the only one. But fortunately for them, they hung around and graduated with me. Elwood City is a rural town. We have farms. We have some remnants of industry. We were in the steel part of Pennsylvania, not the coal mining part. So I've been doing environmental justice work for about 20 years, or 25 years, something like that. The clock keeps ticking. I started out my career at the US EPA Region 9 in San Francisco, and then I moved on to Region 8, which is Denver. And my time at the EPA is a really important part of my past because it came to haunt me later on. While I was at EPA, both in San Francisco and in Denver, I worked on a criminal case investigating a company called W.R. Grace. Has anybody heard of W.R. Grace? Okay. W.R. Grace was, I'm going to say it was, it's probably still around, I don't know. Of the many things that they did, they mined asbestos, which is a natural occurring substance. And they became famous because in Libby, Montana, well, here I can just read it. Libby, Montana is the site of one of America's worst man-made environmental disasters. Toxic asbestos dust from vermiculite mines that helped the town prosper for decades has killed hundreds of residents, sickening thousands more. Victims continue to surface. And I got this from a website called asbestos.com. So I was working on the W.R. Grace case, and people were literally, families were dying because the parents would go out to the mine and then they would come home and they would have asbestos dust on their clothing and it would get thrown into the washing machine and thereby spread around to the rest of the house. So entire families were dying, getting sick and dying. People, just by being in the town, there was just so much asbestos dust kicked out, and ambient asbestos dust, that town was plagued. I think 400 people died from an asbestos-related illness, so that would be lung cancer, mesothelioma, other respiratory disease, and 3,000 more are still sick in Libby, Montana. I raised Libby, Montana because after I worked on this for years in San Francisco and in Denver, I was living in New York and I drove home to visit my parents, or my mom and my brother. And my brother comes out to the car as I'm getting ready to drive back to New York City, and he says, "Oh yeah, and we got this letter from the government." And I said, "What letter from the government?" He said, "Here, let me give it to you." So I looked at the letter. It was from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, otherwise known as the ATSDR. ATSDR is an arm of the Centers for Disease Control, and one of their roles is to evaluate the health exposure from Superfund sites and other contaminated sites. So this letter said, dear resident, you live on 13th Street in Elwood City, and you've been exposed to asbestos from an asbestos factory at the bottom of your street. Literally 1 block from my street was a street called Factory Avenue, and it was filled with factories. The factory right at the bottom of my street, for as long as I can remember, it was dormant, so I was pretty young when it shut down, but it processed asbestos from Libby, Montana. In fact, something like 80% of that Libby, Montana asbestos went to a factory a block from where I grew up, and a factory in the next town over called Newcastle, Pennsylvania. We didn't know what was happening at this factory. There was, in fact, a playground within the fence line of that factory. I played in that playground. On the playground were giant mounds of shiny material that I came to learn later was asbestos spent material that had been processed. But we thought it was really cool, and we pretended that it was jewelry, and some people took it home, and their parents lined their flower beds with it. My mom had some in the house that was in our potted plants. Decades later, we find out what they were manufacturing there and what they were processing, asbestos from Libby, Montana. This is a picture of the health consultation that the ATSDR did. Some of the things that it said were, go to the doctor immediately. If you're a smoker, stop. They didn't know about the playground, so I told them about that. And then I called people that I knew from US EPA in Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania State Agency. And the people at US EPA weren't very interested. My contact there, who was the head of the environmental justice work there, he wasn't too interested in it because most of the community was white. Most of it was working class. It was a community where there was a lot of racism. So one person told me, oh, this is the center of some Aryan group, we don't want to get involved there. So my family flew under the radar at this less than 1%, and all of my lovely neighborhoods, many of whom were not smokers and died of emphysema and lung cancer prematurely, particularly the people whose houses were right along Factory Avenue across the street. Anyway, this is the backdrop. I had been doing environmental justice work for years because my parents had instilled in me just a desire to work in civil rights. And I stumbled into a job at US EPA and just found something that I fell in love with because I loved science and I loved civil rights. And so I just thought it was really cool to be able to marry these two things and work on them. I did go to the doctor, as we were told to in the letter, and my doctor did a chest x-ray. He saw damaged tissue in my lungs, and the first thing that he told me is, don't tell your insurance company that you were exposed to asbestos, because they won't want to pay. So we got to keep that a secret. And it made me think about people in all these other communities that I've worked with across the country and around the world. And, we get really tied up in, here is the home and here is the facility. I don't hear a lot of conversations talking about healthcare and what people who've been exposed, whether it's asbestos or a refinery or whatever it might be, a cement kiln, you don't hear a lot of people talking about challenges around health insurance and getting your insurance to pay for it. Me being a lawyer, I called some lawyers and told them what had happened. And no lawyers were really willing to work with me because I wasn't sick. And as a reminder, mesothelioma can take 50 years to gestate. So there I was, and here I am. Fortunately, I'm not sick. My family doesn't seem to be sick. But with exposure to asbestos, you just never know. So this was ironic. This was validating. I don't know. It was just a bunch of things for me to learn 10 or 15 years after I'd been working on environmental justice issues that I had been exposed, and that I was really not that much different from communities that I'd been working with. So I wanted to share that with you just kind of as a backdrop. This is who I am. Now I'll get a little bit into what's a little bit more boring, which is the California Environmental Justice Framework. And me being a lawyer, I got to have some slides with laws on them. So California is unique, and feel free to not read any of these things, but California is unique in that environmental justice is defined in statute. Now, I worked in Massachusetts. There is no legal definition of environmental justice in Massachusetts. And I have to say, Massachusetts is pretty far ahead of some other states. There may be other states that define environmental justice. I think New York might have a definition. But our definition was just updated by AB 1628, which passed this summer, and the governor signed, I think, in September, making this a much longer than it had been. But it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of all races, cultures, incomes, national origins with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, regulations, and policies. And then we go on to talk about what access to a healthy environment and what all of these things mean. So this is the backdrop of environmental justice work in Massachusetts. In addition to that, though, there are a couple of civil rights laws that are also governing. One is Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin in any program that has federal funding. And really, it means any agency that has federal funding. If your agency, like my agency, has $1 of federal funding, then this applies to everything that we do. In addition to that, in California, we have also a civil rights law, and it's largely mirrors the federal, but it includes other things like ethnic group identification, age, sexual orientation, physical disability, a lot of things that were left out of the federal law in 1964. There are a couple of things that are important to note about these civil rights laws. First of all, at least with respect to the federal law, you do not have a private right of action. And that means that you cannot go to court to enforce Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act unless you can prove intent. And this, unfortunately, was something that was decided on case law back in, I want to say 2000 or 2001. There was a law in New Jersey called South Camden Citizens in Action. And a community in South Camden, New Jersey went to court, actually represented by one of the lawyers here in California, the late, great Luke Cole, who founded the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. He was one of the lawyers. And Luke and another lawyer from Philadelphia brought this case saying that the siting of a cement plant in a community of color in South Camden was violative of the Civil Rights Act. And they claimed in that case that the Civil Rights Act applied and they could go to court because whether or not they proved intent, it created a disparate effect on that community. So for about 4 days, the environmental justice community was really excited because a district court had decided in favor of the community. It was a wonderful, amazing few days. But unfortunately, 4 days later, the US Supreme Court found in a completely different case, completely different kind of case, called Alexander v. Sandoval. It was a woman in, I think it was Alabama, who brought a civil rights case saying that she should be entitled to take her driver's license test in Spanish. And unfortunately, the US Supreme Court denied her that right and said she couldn't prove intent, that there was an intent to discriminate against her. And that really killed Title VI for most of the environmental justice movement. Having said that, though, you can file an administrative complaint. And what that means is that you file a complaint. It could be as simple as a letter. You send it to whoever the funding agency is, say the US EPA, claiming a Title VI violation. And then that agency, US EPA, let's say, will do an investigation to determine whether or not that is in fact the case. And the unfortunate thing, and what distinguishes this from a right to go to court, is that the proponent, the plaintiff, doesn't have a right to be heard. So it really is just up to EPA and whatever the agency is that you're claiming discriminated. We have had some successful cases in California. One is a case in Kettleman City, which is in the San Joaquin Valley, where this case has gone on forever, but it's a siting or expansion of a hazardous waste landfill and incinerator. None of the environmental review documents were in a language that was accessible to the community. Most people there, their primary language is Spanish. None of the documents were provided in Spanish. And in the end, the state of California, that was the licensing agency, the Department of Toxic Substances and Control, had to take some steps to address the civil rights issues. And among those things is language access policy that lays out what their requirements are with respect to people who are not English language proficient. So, another thing that that is completely new to me and that I like about California is AB 1887, which is also a civil rights law that prohibits state travel, state-funded travel, to states that have laws that we consider to be violative of civil rights. So right now there are 11 states. There are exceptions, but I think that they're very rare. So if I get an invitation to any one of these states, I cannot go on state travel. And the list is growing because when I moved here in 2017, Oklahoma was not on that list. So the Attorney General's office implements this program, and they are paying attention. So coming back to the Air Resources Board and CARB, it was in 2001 that our board, it was December of 2001, that our board approved this document, Policies and Actions for Environmental Justice. 2001 was about the time that things were going on in other states as well. This is when I was living in Massachusetts and working for Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs on environmental justice issues. So there was this moment in time where there were a lot of states that were working on environmental justice policies, thinking about how they were going to integrate them. And there was really great leadership from the federal US EPA that was at the same time building programs and its Office of Environmental Justice, and had a whole array of resources that states could use, including funding. Much of that is not happening anymore, and anyway. So this is what we did in 2001, and some of the things that are in this document is we're integrating environmental justice. We're working with our districts and other stakeholders. We're training our staff. We're doing an annual status report to the board. Some of these things, air monitoring studies, we actually did and had to do as a part of some statutes that were passed, and particularly around child community health. And we did a study around 3 elementary schools at the time. When I looked at this, when I was interviewing for my job at CARB, I looked at this document and I said, wow, there are some things in here that are relevant today. It has weathered well. One of the questions for my interview was, so what have we done? What's happening? How could this have existed in 2001 and you're just now interviewing me in 2016? Part of the problem was that it was an unfunded mandate. CARB didn't have the staff, dedicated staff to implement environmental justice programs. They certainly had staff who were interested in it, but they had to do it along with their other duties. And this document just fizzled, unfortunately. But you can still find it on our website. And at the top of my list of things to do is to update this and actually start implementing it. I was actually hired, and my position was envisioned as being just a single person to implement environmental justice programs across an agency of what is now about 1,700 people. So you can imagine that that was a pretty daunting task. I'm going to talk a little bit about a law that passed a couple of years ago, and that opened the door for me at least to hire some staff to help me think about these things and help implement the programs. So if you hear somebody from CARB speaking, you may very well see this chart. I think it's in almost every PowerPoint presentation that we do before the board. But it shows that, our air quality in California has improved amazingly since the 80s, when I first moved here, and there were air alerts where you couldn't go outside. And the air quality has improved a lot, and we know a lot more about it. So this is for diesel particulate matter. We know that diesel particulate matter is toxic because of the size of the particles that can ingest in your lungs, but also because of what is in that particle. And unfortunately, while the air quality has improved a lot across California generally, disadvantaged communities are still left behind. And disadvantaged communities, I will just say, is it's a legally defined term. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But when I talk about disadvantaged communities in other parts of the country, people wonder where that term comes from. You hear people say environmental justice communities, disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities. Generally speaking, it means people of color and low-income people. So that was 2001. Enter 2006. Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, and he signed into law the California Global Warming Solutions Act. This was the first of its kind, and I think to this day, there are 2 other states that have Global Warming Solutions Act. One is Massachusetts, where I come from. One is Connecticut. And what's interesting is that when I was interviewing for this position out here, a couple of things. I did a lot of research looking at, first of all, what were environmental justice groups in California saying about the California Air Resources Board, because that would really center my agenda. Whatever they were saying, whatever their complaints were, this is where we need to start. But interestingly, as I was flying from Boston to Sacramento, I sat down to read the Global Warming Solutions Act, also known as AB 32, Assembly Bill 32. And I had been actually litigating a case in Massachusetts. As Trina said, I worked at an organization called Conservation Law Foundation, where I directed the Massachusetts program. We filed a case and took it to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, trying to get them to enforce the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. There was a section in the Massachusetts Act that said, among other things, that Massachusetts was required to issue regulations with declining aggregate emissions of greenhouse gases or sources of greenhouse gases. And those words are very important. I quote them from the statute because as I was flying to California, I decided to read AB 32, and it was the exact same language. So when I got back to Massachusetts, I said, oh my God, you plagiarized. We plagiarized California. And I knew some activists who were active in writing the Massachusetts GWSA, and they said, yeah, we did plagiarize it. We pulled out AB 32 and we copied the language. So that was pretty remarkable, and it was exciting for me because we took this case to the state Supreme Court and we won. So it seemed right that I come to California and get to work on AB 32. So AB 32 has a number of different pieces to it. It has some things that are market-based mechanisms, and those are the things that that AB 32 is most known for, and those are the things that we get the most criticism for at CARB. So first of all, there's cap and trade program, and I'm going to spend most of the time talking about cap and trade. Cap and trade is a market-based mechanism that we developed at CARB, and you basically put a cap on greenhouse gases, and there are facility sectors that are regulated under the cap and trade program. This includes electric generation facilities, it includes refineries, it includes cement kilns. So there's a cap that ratchets down annually. And then the facilities that emit greenhouse gases can either purchase an allowance, which is basically a permit to emit greenhouse gases. You can purchase that at auction, which we do 4 times a year. So far, since our first auction, which was about 7 years ago, we've generated over $12 billion. Those $12 billion are supposed to be reinvested into the communities and invested in activities where we can actually quantify greenhouse gas reductions. There are also carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are things like preserving forests. So, for example, California's biggest carbon offset here in California, and I should say that greenhouse gases are not local pollutants, so in theory, you can get carbon offsets from other parts of the world. We're still focused in the United States here, but we sell offsets in Arkansas, Maine, Ohio, but the Yurok tribe, which is way up near the border with Oregon, they are our biggest offset developer here in California, and they have managed to purchase back forested land that had been taken from them so that they can reclaim their tribal, traditional heritage land. It's pretty amazing. I was up there a couple of months ago, and I got to participate in a ceremony that they had for some sacred land that they had just gotten back into their hands, working collaboratively with a logging company. But these things, in the low carbon fuel standard, which is also kind of has a cap on carbon intensity in motor fuels, and that's ratcheted down. These market-based programs are very controversial in the environmental justice community for many reasons. Part of it, though, large part of it, is that if you have a facility that can simply buy its way out of reducing greenhouse gases, then they could, in theory, purchase more and emit more greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide itself, is not dangerous to our health, except for, climate change. But there are a number of scientists out there who have been studying greenhouse gases and have determined that there are co-pollutants that are emitted with greenhouse gases, and those co-pollutants are dangerous. So this visual is part of a report that was done by our sister agency called the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. They published this, I think, in the end of 2016 or the beginning of 2017, and it was their first attempt at looking at the relationship between greenhouse gases and co-pollutants. And while they said that it was inconclusive, it needs more work, it did say that there's a positive correlation between greenhouse gases and PM 2.5 and toxic air pollution emissions. And this was especially notable for refineries, hydrogen plants, and cement plants. So this visual here talks a little bit about what a disadvantaged community is. There's something called Cal EnviroScreen, and you can reach it by going to the website of our sister agency, also known as OWEHA. And they have about 20 different indicators that they use to identify disadvantaged communities. 10 of them are emission or exposure based, and then 10 of them are socioeconomic. OWEHA is constantly updating Cal EnviroScreen, and some of the challenges, so this is San Diego. Some of the challenges are that it doesn't really quantify very well rural areas where people are not so densely populated. It's also a challenge in the Bay Area. If you want to compare the Bay Area to anywhere else in the state, because the cost of living here is so much more than it is in other parts of the state. And then San Diego here in the border region, although OWEHA is updating it, constantly updating it, but they've been working on quantifying pollution on the Mexican side of the border. Because what happened with the first iteration of this is that they didn't quantify any pollution in Mexico. And so what that meant was that border communities like San Diego, like Imperial Valley, it made them look as though they weren't exposed as much, when in fact there's a lot of cross-boundary air pollution, water pollution, and hazardous waste. So OWEHA has been working on improving that. You can also go to the website and play with it. It's pretty cool. In doing my research before I moved out here, or back out here, I spent a lot of time, in particular, on a website of an organization called the California Environmental Justice Alliance, also known as CEJA. It is a coalition of EJ groups, but they had been doing a lot of research around cap and trade. One thing that I should say is that another thing under AB 32, AB 32 created an Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or committee, and this is comprised of environmental activists from across the state. They were the body that was most instrumental in creating my position, but they also put a lot of pressure on CARB around co-pollutants. The Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, also known as EJAC, comes together every time CARB puts together what's called a scoping plan. And the scoping plan is basically an implementation plan for AB 32 that lasts for 5 years. And then we go back at it again. So the board adopted a scoping plan in March of 2017. The EJAC worked on it with us for 2 years. We're required to update it every 5 years, but we also update it when new things happen. So some new things have happened. One is that Governor Brown signed an executive order on carbon neutrality by 2045. There was also SB 32 that set greenhouse gas limits for 2030 and 2040. So we're going to have another scoping plan coming up fairly soon. Anyway, though, back to cap and trade. So CARB got sued over its cap and trade program by the California Chamber of Commerce. And the California Chamber of Commerce alleged that cap and trade was actually a tax. And if it's a tax, CARB doesn't have the authority to create that program. A tax requires a supermajority of the legislature, so 2/3 vote. So one of the things that Governor Brown did, was committed to doing before he left, was making sure that cap and trade is safe. We ended up taking that case to the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that cap and trade wasn't a tax, but Governor Brown still wanted to get a 2/3 majority. So what had been a program that was enshrined really in policy that we developed in regulation at CARB became enshrined in state law. And that state law is called AB 398. It extends our cap and trade program to 2030. But in order to get enough votes to get a supermajority, there was a lot of deal making that went on. And there were a lot of environmental justice advocates who were at the Capitol working on this. And I can't say that the environmental justice community uniformly supports the result, but we're working on it together. And so the compromise was Assembly Bill 617. And Assembly Bill 617, which was passed in July of 2017, so just a few months after I got to CARB, and just a few months after I decided that my focus had to be what communities were most concerned about, toxic air pollution from sources in their communities, sources that might be emitting co-pollutants. I came in thinking, you know what, I'm one person, cap and trade is here, I'm not going to dismantle cap and trade, but what can I do about the exposures that people are exposed to? So as I was starting to put together a plan for working on that, AB 617 passed, which is essentially that. It requires CARB, in partnership with the air districts, to identify the most exposed communities, collect data, air quality data, and put together plans for reducing those emissions. And it had a few other things that went along with it, but that was basically the focus of AB 617. It requires a three-way partnership that put communities at the table. And this photograph is the signing of this, and I actually think, so we signed it up here at Treasure Island, and then there was also a signing in LA. And there were some EJ groups who opposed this, who picketed the signing in LA. So it was a controversial bill, and it continues to be controversial, not just with EJ groups, it's controversial with industry, it's controversial with the districts who need sufficient funding to be able to implement it. So it is not an easy piece of legislation, and we've been at it for a year now, and we're about to see how effective the bill is and how effective we are as regulators. I'll get into that in a minute, but first, overarching components of AB 617. So I mentioned collecting data. So here in the Bay Area, there are 10 communities selected across the state that we identified as the most exposed from a variety of different sources. Some are rural, some are oil and gas communities. 2 communities here, West Oakland, and there was enough data already collected in West Oakland, some of it by a local community group there, West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, who partnered with the Environmental Defense Fund and some Google and some other folks to collect data. So West Oakland had enough data and it got to go directly to the emission reduction plan. Richmond is the other community in the Bay Area. And in Richmond, they're doing a first year of air monitoring before they put together their emission reduction plan. So it required a statewide monitoring plan. What does community air monitoring look like? What questions are you asking before you site monitors? How do you know where you're going to site them? These were some of the things that CARB had to do to put together kind of the nuts and bolts of the program and how it was going to work. It required us to make data accessible, so to create a portal where not only our air monitoring data is, not only the district's air monitoring data, but also air monitoring from communities would be from across the state would be included. It included funding, a lot of funding, some incentive funding, close to $1 billion. I think I have another slide about it. $25 million in grants to local community groups so far. And then finally, the action plan. How are we going to reduce the emissions? So, identifying the communities. California is a huge state. We identified 10, and obviously that is well below the number of communities that really are in need of this kind of attention. The 10 was really based on capacity, not only our capacity, but the capacity of the local districts that we're working with. I also want to talk for a second more about community air monitoring. Community air monitoring is a growing effort, and this effort is allowed because technology, air quality has, and our regulatory programs have forced technology to create low-cost sensors. So you could go on Amazon or some other website and you can buy a low-cost sensor for $250, and you can put it outside your house, or some of them are made for indoors. But these low-cost sensors are fairly accurate for certain pollutants, in particular PM 2.5 and PM 10. For other sorts of pollutants, it's still in the development, but these pollutants, they are pretty good, and they provide real-time data. That's much different from a regulatory grade monitor that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Those are the things that we base our enforcement on. Those expensive regulatory monitors mostly measure regional pollution, and they are not real time. Some of them are 24 hours, some of them are annual, depending on what the pollutant is. So low-cost sensors were a really important part of getting AB 617 passed. And there is possibly the largest monitoring network in the country, certainly in the state, which is in Imperial Valley. And in Imperial, where a lot of the pollution that they have is related to border crossings, where people idle in their cars anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, depending on whether or not it's a holiday. Imperial has a lot of wind-blown dust. It's the desert region, there's sand. It's also got the Salton Sea, which, for those of you who don't know, is the largest lake in California that was artificially created, and it's now receding because we're not putting water into it anymore. And it's creating wind-blown dust off of the playa, which has a lot of pollutants in it from agricultural runoff. So a group in Imperial called Comité Civico del Valle, in partnership with a professor at University of Washington named Edmund Cito, along with another researcher at California Department of Public Health, and at an organization called Tracking California. His name is Dr. Paul English. And a host of other academics and people who contributed came together to create this seminal air monitoring network of 40 monitors that spanned about 100 miles from Mexicali, where there's one monitor, all the way up to eastern Coachella Valley, so through Salton Sea region. If you're interested in looking at their data, they do have a website called ivanair.org. And you can either look at a list of their monitors or you can map them. Some of the things that they did was create school flag programs where some of the monitors were sited at schools, and then school kids could go online and look at the air quality, and then they would raise a flag depending on what the air quality is. So green for good, red for bad. And that way, teachers and parents could modify what their students were doing. If it's a bad air quality day, you don't want your kids playing outside for recess. So that air monitoring network, the Ivan Air Monitoring Network, was really important because it showed that it could be done. And that monitoring system was initially funded by the National Institutes of Health. And so doing this is not cheap at all. That initial effort cost $2 million, and they still needed money to continue the functioning of the network. So it's not a cheap thing to do, but in these days, particularly since we have wildfire danger, low-cost sensors are really important, and AB 617 is a really important piece of legislation. The other thing that I will say about the Ivan network is that when CARB started implementing AB 617 and thinking about how you put together a community air monitoring network that measures localized community-scale air pollution, it's really important to root that in the local knowledge of the community, because they know where the community knows where the polluting sources are better than I do from my desk in Sacramento or some of our engineers who are in LA. So it was really important with AB 617 to bring in community knowledge and make sure that that was center to the implementation. So here are the first year communities. 2 in the San Joaquin Valley, South Central Fresno, Shafter, which is it's an agricultural community, but also oil and gas. 3 communities in the South Coast region, which is the LA Air Basin. Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson are refinery communities, and they also have pretty extensive goods movement. The ports of LA and Long Beach, which are the number 1 and 2 ports in the country, are there within that footprint, along with the refineries. So here we have Imperial, Calexico, which is just across the border from Mexicali, where there is a lot of pollution that crosses the border. El Centro Heber, San Bernardino. San Bernardino is a big goods movement place. They come in through the ports of LA and Long Beach. They go to warehouses in San Bernardino, also in Southern Kern, but San Bernardino largely. And then I mentioned the Bay Area communities, and then in Sacramento South Sacramento, around Florin Road, which is a community of color. Our board is about to consider year 2 communities. We're going to have a board meeting on December 5th in Oakland, where we look at the emission reduction plan that West Oakland and Bay Area put together, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And then on December 12th and 13th, that's where we select our year 2 communities. And if you go to our website, you can see some of our documents, but right now the proposal is 3 new communities. Stockton, Eastern Coachella Valley, and what is the third one? Oh, Southeast LA, so 2 within the South Coast. But these are the components of AB 617. So the things that we take into account in putting together the emission reduction program are, do we need new regulations? And those could be regulations from the Air District, those could be regulations from CARB. So one thing that you will see in the West Oakland air monitoring or emission reduction plan is that CARB needs to address ships at the Port of Oakland. And ships and locomotives are very tricky because their regulation of them, generally speaking, are preempted by federal authority because of the Commerce Clause. But CARB regulates ships at berth. And what that means is that if we have an at-berth regulation, a ship that comes in and is unloading, rather than keeping its engines running while it's unloading, our at-berth reg will provide for them to be able to plug in and use electricity. And really electrification, power safety shutoffs aside, wildfires aside, electrification is an important piece of reducing greenhouse gases and improving air quality across the state. So you see enforcement, we'll be doing more of that, risk reduction audits, and permitting. And then there's the incentive programs there as well. So this is our blueprint. It's on our website. This lays out everything that I just said about how the program is supposed to function. Public engagement and community partnerships are central to that. And so what we did was we required each community that is working on air monitoring or on emission reduction plan, they have to put together a community steering committee. And this is something that we adopted from the Ivan Air Monitoring Network. They had a community steering committee that told them where to put the monitors, that helped them distill what the question was that they were trying to ask or answer through air monitoring, and that actually came first, and then a community steering committee. So in Richmond, in Oakland, and the rest of those communities where we're working, there are community steering committees, and those steering committees, generally speaking, meet about once a month. And they have to be 51% community residents. So there are people from industry on some of them, and there are people from city government, land use agencies, public health agencies. All of those are really a really important part of the equation for the success of this program. And 2 things that are particularly urgent that I'm hearing from communities is one, besides, well, one key thing, there needs to be improved public health. And so the question is, how do you do that? How do you get the baseline information? How do you track it? And these are things that we're struggling with as an agency, and we do have an advisory body to help us with this, and we're fortunate on that advisory body to have physicians and other public health researchers who are trying to help us answer those questions, as well as community residents. So, criteria for success. This is what we're thinking, having not started implementing any of these yet. Quantitative public health goals, air quality standards, things that we can measure, toxic risk reduction. Public process has to continue. throughout the implementation, which is 5 years, after we approve the plan, after the CARB governing board approves the plan. And then review and updates, which we do before our board, but we also come to any community who wants to hear from us. In fact, as I said, we're only putting forth 3 communities this year, and I was at a meeting, last week I was in Shafter on Monday, and then later I was at a conference in Yosemite at Tenaya Lodge, and at the Shafter meeting, the mayor of the town of Arvin was there. Arvin is a small town near Bakersfield, oil and gas and ag town. And the mayor is in his 20s, he's probably 28. I think he's working on his master's. He told me, I had met him once before, and he told me when I saw him on Monday that he had to skip class in order to be able to come to this meeting. But it was really important to him, and it's very important that Arvin gets some relief. So a couple days later at Tenaya Lodge, I'm talking about AB 617, and I'm talking about what we need to be prepared to do for communities that are not on that short list this year. So there will be more meetings with the mayor of Arvin to talk about what his concerns are and what it is that we can do through the course of the next year, short of putting them on that list. We did that with the Eastern Coachella Valley community. We went to a number of community meetings with folks there, EJ groups, unions. We met with the school board in order to get things underway. And so that's an important piece of it. AB 617 is very, very dense in technical information. And since it is so technical, we found through the first year that it's pretty important to be able to help communities on the front end to understand what it is that we're doing, for us to understand what their concerns are, so that if they are selected in the coming year, as Coachella Valley is, that we're ready to hit the ground running. Stockton is another community where California Environmental Protection Agency, which is our umbrella organization, does an enforcement initiative around different parts of the state where they bring in inspectors from the various Cal EPA agencies. So they did a really successful one in Stockton, and I met some groups in Stockton who were not environmental justice groups. They'd never been involved in the environment. Many of them were faith organizations. They were cultural and arts organizations. I met a group in particular called Little Manila Rising that took me on this amazing tour of Stockton and taught me about the Filipino heritage there. I'm really excited for groups like that to be at the table and to learn from their peers from other communities. So that's one of the really wonderful things about AB 617. So I mentioned incentive funding. So there has been close to $1 billion. I think it's $995,000 that have been allocated under AB 617, and this is money that comes out of the cap and trade money, cap and trade proceeds. And this is for industry to be able to better afford to switch over from polluting, say, diesel engines to zero-emission vehicles, whether it's trucks, whether it's cargo handling equipment, forklifts, school buses. It's also funded indoor air filtration at schools. And then this $1 billion also has complementary programs. We move a lot of money at CARB. And so we provide vouchers for zero-emission vehicles for like cars and trucks. We provide money for agricultural equipment to turn over. We have a lot of money from VW that is intended to reduce other pollutants like NOx. So all of these programs are kind of working together and focused in these communities, these 10 communities right now. And besides CARB's many programs trying to leverage each other in those communities, we're also working with some of our sister agencies. So the Department of Pesticides Regulation, for example, is very active in some of the farming communities that we're working in. The Public Utilities Commission and the Energy Commission are very interested in investing more money in these communities, particularly around things like electric vehicle infrastructure and being able to catalyze renewables. So AB 617 is much broader than what's called out actually in the letter of the law. And then I mentioned that we have a $25 million grant program, or thus far we've been allocated $25 million to invest in local community groups. Now those community groups do not have to be limited to those 10 communities that I laid out, or the 3 new ones. They're communities anywhere in the state that want to work on capacity building, outreach. We have a grantee that worked on getting high school students involved in our steering committee process, as well as we have some grantees who have put up their own air monitoring networks or are in the process. So this is the state of California. This is where everyone is located. This was the first year. This was the first $10 million in May of 2018. We're going to be awarding another $5 million before the end of this year, and then $10 million next year. And that has been really important, not only for the communities that are engaged in AB 617 communities, but this money helps communities that are on the longer list prepare, whether it's collecting data so that they don't have to wait and can go straight to an emission reduction plan, or school flag programs, or you name it. We've got a whole host of grantees, and many of them who have not been involved in this air quality space before. The other thing, oh my goodness, it's 6:15. The other thing is that we've also awarded grants to some tribes, and some of those tribes are putting together tribal air monitoring networks, which is pretty cool. I'm almost there. Okay, so where do we go from here? I love this cartoon. You know, this is a famous painting here with EJ people, which actually could also come from another famous painting. But anyway, my staff and I tried to stand on the front lines with communities. So we spend a lot of time doing outreach to communities, visiting them, getting to know them so that we can better inform the agency and so that we can better create the gateway for them to be at the table, whether it's meeting with me, whether it's meeting with my boss, Richard Corey, who's the executive director, whether it's meeting with our board and our board chair, Mary Nichols. My job is to stand with the frontline communities and get them to the table. And they tell us what we need to do. So it's ironic that California has the 5th largest economy in the world. 40% of the goods coming into this country come through the ports of LA and Long Beach. And they go along the 710 freeway into San Bernardino and the Inland Empire. We supply 80% of the almonds in the world. And this is just, you know, little bits and pieces. You know, our economy is much bigger than that and much more diverse. And we're the 3rd oil and gas producer in the country after Texas and North Dakota. Yet, if you look at this map, and this is from CNBC, this is 2017, we're 4th in income inequality after New York. Connecticut is number 2. I don't know what number 3 is, maybe Hawaii or something like that. Anyway, we're number 4. So no, it's no wonder that every time we have a new IPO happening in Silicon Valley and some new people become millionaires, we also have people who become poorer and people who have to go and live on the streets. That's something that we haven't quite been able to figure out. But it's a huge challenge. And it's a challenge for people living on the front lines because what most of the world sees is California, we're number 5 in the world. But not everybody is number 5 in the world. So my friends who are here might recognize some of these pictures. I visit all over California, neighborhoods, and talk to people all over California. And these are their homes. This is Wilmington. This is a street that ends, and there's a chain link fence and a huge refinery on the other side of the fence. This is right here in the Bay Area. Last week, my friends here took me to meet with this community in Rodeo. You see that hill there, and at the top of the hill, you can barely see it. You probably can't see it from there. This is the tank farm you see at the top of the hill. This is New Star, the one that exploded last month. And people lived right next to that. This is the 710 freeway. This is the Port of LA. People live here. And my job isn't done, and believe me, I have a lot of sleepless nights, until I can figure out or work with communities to figure out how we're going to stop this disproportionate pollution burden. And it really isn't even a matter of just stopping the disproportionate nature of it, but we cannot continue to live this way. So it takes a lot of great minds, not just in Sacramento, but the people who are actually living out here to be able to figure this out. And frankly, I think that part of it is figuring out how we get off of fossil fuels. And I will say that Governor Newsom has earmarked some funding, at least to think about how we're going to begin phasing that out. It's going to take a lot more than that, but at least it's a start. So I'm going to close with James Baldwin, who is a legendary African-American author. The late, great James Baldwin sent a letter to the civil rights activist Angela Davis when she was in a prison in Birmingham, Alabama. So I will read, "We must fight for your life as though it were our own," which it is. "We must render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night." He's basically saying, we're in it together. So the fact that she's in prison and he's not doesn't make a difference because they're going to be coming for him. And so if there's one thing that I would love to leave with you tonight is don't forget these folks. They live with this every day. Don't forget my family living in Pennsylvania with an asbestos factory. We're in it together, and it's going to take all of us and a commitment from all of us to be able to solve it. So I think that's the end. Yes, it is. So thank you. And if you want to reach me, this is my email address. But since there's some time, are there questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to leave you with that handheld, and there's another one on the other side of the room that I'm going to take around the audience to get questions. Okay, so yes, we do have time for questions. I hope you all will raise your voice and engage in a conversation. It's great to have her here, so let's take an opportunity to bring up other thoughts and questions that have come to your mind over the course of the time listening to her.
Uh-oh.
Okay, the first hand I saw was on the opposite side of the room, but I'll take this one that's closer and that'll come over here.
I have a particular concern about the air quality in the San Joaquin Valley and almonds, but I just wonder how much work is being done to reach out to non-English speakers, because until we do that, the very poorest communities are so busy making a living, they're just not going to be able to engage in what you're doing, it seems to me.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because with the most recent wildfires that happened, I remember seeing, and I can't remember what paper it was in, a picture of a farm worker harvesting grapes with the flames and the smoke behind him. And that's one thing that we're missing with wildfires. There are people who are still going to work. My sister lives in LA near the community and near the Getty Museum. She wasn't evacuated, but it was kind of iffy. And I'm reading in the LA Times about people, household workers, who are going to work in houses where the families have been evacuated because nobody told them. So, getting back to your question about farm workers and, well, a couple of things. Yes, we do a lot of outreach. Farm workers is an area where I really feel like we need to do more. So I've been trying to reach out to farm worker organizations, not just in the San Joaquin Valley, but also in the Central Coast area. I meet them with Spanish-speaking staff. The meetings that we have, both the meetings that that CARB has, but also the meetings that are hosted by the Air District in the San Joaquin Valley, they all have simultaneous translation, and the documents are also all in Spanish. Right now we're just doing Spanish, but I'm really interested in knowing what other languages, and particularly as we span out, we may be doing Mandarin or Punjabi or whatever. But there is an effort to reach out to them. And I have to say that the EJ groups that we work with, the partners in those regions, are also very good at bringing people from the local communities, even if it requires them, in some cases, to rent a bus or a van to be able to get people to our meetings. So we are doing outreach. We are doing bilingual Spanish outreach, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I certainly am not satisfied yet, because I don't think that anything that we have done yet has really incorporated a farm worker perspective.
Oh, hi, Veronica.
Hi, LaDonna.
Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful, especially sharing your background with W.R. Grace. Like, that company should be shut down. I know that there was a lawsuit some years ago, right? And for those of you that don't know, there was also a movie that was called The Civil Action, in a book, wasn't it? That
Oh, that was W.R. Grace. Yeah, that was in Woburn, Massachusetts. Yeah.
And I believe John Travolta starred in that movie.
right.
Because that's when we all started realizing what environmental justice was about. W.R. Grace also had a hand in Midway Village in Daly City, primarily Black community, where they did all kind of unspeakable things with the data. And that community, too, filed a Title VI. Unfortunately, again, what we're finding in California is Black communities are being ignored through this process, especially when it comes to their health filing Title VI. It's not moving through the courts. Kettleman was able to do that. I believe that was the Latino community. So we're not saying that it is us against them, but what we are saying is priorities are being made for immigrants, Latino communities, while the Black communities continue to be ignored. I'm so glad you showed that picture, because actually, as I'm sitting here, not only had that family been sick, and the kids are being, even now today, taken to the hospital that we feel are residuals left over. I actually sat through this, but I'm getting calls that my grandbaby is in emergency, and he's been having breathing issues since the fires and the explosions. And so what I guess I want to ask you is, what advice do you give to our future health professionals here and doctors connecting what we're being exposed to fence and frontline communities, what can they take away from this in being able to start making a difference? Because when we go to the doctors, first thing they say is, well, we know this happened, but we don't know how to make a connection. So what advice would you give them?
Thank you, LaDonna. That's a really hard question. And I should say, LaDonna is with an organization in Vallejo called All Positives Possible, and she and some friends generously took me and one of my colleagues and some other colleagues from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District on a tour, and also to meet with some residents in the area. You know, LaDonna and I and some of others of us know a scientist by the name of Dr. Ray Tompkins. And Dr. Tompkins is a retired African-American professor of science from San Francisco State, I think. He lives in Bayview Hunters Point, and he has been working really hard on his project to make sure that doctors and nurses who live and work in these overexposed communities have some sort of a curriculum in environmental health. And I've known him for two and a half years, and he's been talking about it for that long. But this conference that I was at, which was a public health conference in Tenaya Lodge in Yosemite, I think that's where I was. I've been at so many conferences lately. But anyway, there was another physician who brought that up and said that, you know, the environmental health curriculum that they get is like a day or two in their medical career, in their studies. So that's one thing that we need to do. We need to start making some changes, and so that medical professionals are learning about environmental justice and are learning more about environmental exposure. So that's one thing. But all of you here, I hope that through, you know, all the students here, through your exposure to this environmental justice series, thinks a lot about environmental health and what's going on in local communities. And then the other thing, LaDonna, and I don't know if I have like a single answer to your question, but for me, when I met with you last week in Vallejo, and it was really hard for me to stand outside because of the smell near these communities where people live every day. It was almost too much for me. And I have to say, I've experienced the same thing in southern Kern County, around Arvin, Bakersfield, in Wilmington as well. It was really hard for me to experience that. And I think that it's really important to keep bringing professionals, whether they're lawyers or social workers or engineers or doctors and public health people, to experience it right then and there. That was really powerful for me. So I want to support you doing more of that.
Great, thank you so much. I think in response, also thinking about what, as we're offering a public health program to our students who are getting clinically trained, and as a part of that, they get, one single environmental health class. But we hope, right, that all of you, through getting familiarized in your classes and also with some of the speakers, are really thinking and learning about ways to engage and connect directly with the communities in which you serve, ways to build partnerships, and thinks of ways that you can be a supportive advocate of the organizations in those communities, and building bridges between clinical work, public health work, community advocacy work, and the the legislature as well as our agencies, right? That we have to have partnerships and collaboration between those groups, and we really hope that our students are taking that out of their education. I'm going to move to the, okay. I've seen a couple hands, so don't forget your questions. We're going to get to all of you.
Hi, Veronica. So how did you like Yosemite?
It was fabulous, except the air quality was perfect. Although everybody from the valley was telling me that the inversion layer is there and, you know, it's going to be there for the winter. So trust me, I couldn't see the mountains before I was in the mountains.
Oh, so homeless people living beside roads and stuff like that. I was just thinking the other day when our air quality was so bad about this homeless guy that I know who's out in it, you know. Is it possible for some of the money to go to air sensors around their communities or whatever? So they know to go to a shelter or whatever.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be, you know, there are some shelters, and I think that there needs to be outreach and education so that people know that they don't have to stay outside and breathe that. It was really bad. Fortunately, in Sacramento, we haven't had really bad air quality since the fire-related bad air quality since the Camp Fire. But the Camp Fire first of all, my office building where Cal EPA is located in Sacramento is a LEED Platinum building. So, you know, it's like the state-of-the-art, best rating environmental building. We had smoke in the lobby, we had smoke in the elevator banks. We had to close down one of our buildings. And when that fire was happening, I was living in an old building with no HVAC, and I thought that I was going to have to go to my cousin's house, who had a much newer building, like load up my pets and leave. So I definitely understand the exposures that homeless people must be exposed to, not just wildfires. I mean, everybody who's living under a freeway overpass is exposed. That's a problem that we have to solve. And I was trying to remember, one of my colleagues, there had been a proposal by one of the state housing agencies to site a homeless shelter next to a freeway where people were already sleeping underneath. And they reached out to us and said, should we be doing this? And it was a really hard question, because do we want people exposed and living, you know, underneath a freeway and exposed that way? Or, you know, I mean, is it okay to put a shelter there? These are some of the questions that we are working with, you know, sister agencies to try to figure out. The reality is that if the shelter is there, you know, you can make it airtight. People can't open the windows, but you know, there are ways to ensure that the indoor air quality is healthful. We did, during the Camp Fire and maybe some of the other ones, have to actually deploy indoor air monitors in some of the buildings around the city. And to be perfectly honest with you, one of our things that we were thinking about was, we're deploying indoor air monitors in these environmental buildings, but these other agencies don't know what we do. They don't know to ask us. I mean, we need to think about how we can be more responsive as an air quality agency. I think that the Office of Emergency Management does some of that, and we definitely have people on our staff who are wildfire experts, but we're still figuring that out.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. As a student of the Joint Masters of Public Health and PA program. We actually are working on an assignment where we talk about all the environmental effects and how that affects health and how we can treat that in the future. So thank you for that, Dr. Mackey. But my question is more along that lines is I understand that our presidential administration has revoked California's Clean Air Act waiver for setting stricter limits on car emissions than the federal limits. And until this battle is fought out in courts, I was wondering what can or what will CARB do to try and limit emissions without the waiver?
So from a legal perspective, one of the things that we're doing is going to court to see if we can get a stay. So that would mean that our tailpipe standards could stay in place while this authority is being litigated. But that aside, we have had to figure out what our plan is, not only for the pollutants coming out of the tailpipe, the harmful toxic air contaminants, that are coming out, but also greenhouse gases, because it's all sort of wrapped up together. So we have people in our staff who are coming up with a contingency plan for how we're going to meet our greenhouse gas standards, how we're going to pursue attainment of the health-based air quality standards across the state. All of that has had to shift and come into question so that we can continue to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves. So we're hoping that it will be stayed by a court so that we can keep doing what we do. And then the other thing is a contingency plan. And I will say that also, I don't know if you heard that the Trump administration was going after us because, or investigating us under antitrust laws because we entered an agreement with 4 auto companies who voluntarily came to the table to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's very interesting. There are certainly some car companies, a couple of them I think came out siding with the Trump administration on the tailpipe standards because they don't want to have to make 2 different standards, or they want one for the whole country. And they were doing California for the whole country, but now they're hedging their bets. So we definitely have some work to do in terms of car companies, and we're happy that we have the ones who have entered an agreement with us, and there are others who are just kind of waiting out to see what happens.
Now I forgot where the last hand was. I came over here because I thought it was in this zone. Was there somebody else with a question that I was? There.
Hi, Veronica. As a guest, I wanted to make sure I made space for others. But just want to thank you for such an amazing lecture and for everything that you do and being for me personally, being an example, I think, for students of color and other about how we can marry or wed science and policy or civil rights. And so just want to thank you. Veronica, I'm always encouraged by the work that's being done at the California Air Resources Board. And I'm just curious, just for people who are considering professions in this area, whether it's law or policy or engineering, along these lines in terms of us being able to really live in a sustainable fashion here. What words of advice do you have for students or people who are thinking about these things?
And I should say Brian works for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So they are our partner here in the Bay Area and the lead on the what are called stationary sources. So, well, one thing that I've learned, and I am a science nerd, don't get me wrong, but I do not have a science degree. I started out as a pre-med major and then got seduced by journalism, which is what my undergraduate degree is in. And one of the things that at CARB I find a real challenge as I seek to hire staff is that in order to be in one of our professional careers, you have to have a science or engineering background. Fortunately for you, public health is considered science. So a public health background is certainly sufficient to come into a position, a career position at CARB. But one of the challenges is that in doing environmental justice work at CARB, a science or an engineering degree is not, or we also hire economists, but that was a battle. But a science or engineering degree is not necessarily critical for doing environmental justice work. We also have at CARB, we have unions. And the unions ensure parity in our professional positions. So if you're an engineer, your title is air resources engineer, and if you're a scientist, you're an air pollution specialist, and there's parity between those two because of the unions. So in order for us to be able to hire people who also have a policy background, whether that's public policy, sociology, any soft science, we really need a change within our agency. And unfortunately, I feel like there are a lot of people, myself included, who want to do this, but we haven't gotten to that tipping point. And I think that it really has to change because I work with a lot of really dedicated, talented scientists and engineers, but just like I, a science lover, would not walk into a lab and act like I know what I'm doing, they shouldn't be acting like they know what environmental justice is if that isn't their background. So part of my challenge is figuring out how you train an agency of 1,700 people on environmental justice. So that's a real challenge. But for those of you in the room who are students or otherwise thinking about going to work for one of our agencies, it's a really exciting time. I mean, you've heard about our Volkswagen work, which has not stopped at Volkswagen. We're going after other manufacturers of cars and trucks who might be using cheap devices. We're fighting the Trump administration. Right now we have, my agency has 17 lawsuits. So we have that going on. It's a really exciting time. The wildfires bring us a further challenge, and not only the wildfires themselves bring us a challenge, but the public safety shutoffs bring us a challenge because when that power is off, you better believe everybody who's anybody is at Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever trying to get a diesel generator, or when they ran out recently of diesel generators, we actually had to temporarily loosen our standards and let California non-compliant generators come into the state. So we're only going to need you more. And as I laid out when I was talking about AB 617 and everything that we haven't figured out about improving public health, that's where we really need you. There has to be, we've gotten to a point where we can no longer be in silos and not make the connection to public health, because the communities where I'm working and where a lot of folks are working, we won't know that we've been successful until public health starts to improve. So I encourage you all to continue what you're doing, and we need you at CARB. Brian, I'm sure you need them at the Air District. I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity coming up.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have a couple questions on the cap and trade system. So my project is actually on the Richmond refinery, and from my understanding, the caps are only on certain pollutants. So I'm just wondering if there's any plans to make caps on all emissions, like facility-wide. And then my second question is, because facilities are able to buy rights to expand their pollution, is there any plans to get rid of the trade aspect of the cap and trade?
So the cap and trade program only applies to greenhouse gases. So through the cap and trade program itself, we're not reaching any other pollutants that are coming out of that stack. The air district regulates what is coming out of the stacks, and they have a number of regulations that they're working on, some of which they were already working on, but some of it will be incorporated into the AB 617 work that's happening. So that's one thing. And for more information on that, we can figure out who to talk to at the Air District. I'm not putting you on the spot, Brian. In terms of getting rid of the trade aspect, since AB 398, which is the extension of cap and trade to 2030, does not envision getting rid of the trade aspect, right now that's what we have. Having said that, though, so I did my whole education in California, then I moved away for 20 years, and I came back, and when I left, California was a red-purple state, and it just keeps getting bluer and bluer. So anything could happen, and so I wouldn't be surprised if the power of environmental justice activism will bring some changes. I don't know if it'll happen before 2030, but it most certainly could. There are definitely a lot of people who are going into the Capitol, not just from the environmental justice community, but also from industry and from the air districts to try to get more money to implement AB 617. So personally, I don't see the trading aspect going away, but anything could happen. And we have a legislature that is so blue that we as an agency, CARB, are regularly pulled into legislative hearings to explain ourselves. So anything could happen. If there's enough will in the social justice community and the EJ community, AB 398 could be modified.
Do you think that, this is loud. Do you think that awareness is like a big part of that? Like if people in communities knew that programs like this existed and were out there and trying to help them, that maybe if more people knew about it and like demanded it in their communities, then you could kind of be able to have more funding or?
Yeah, there is a lot of awareness, particularly in the overburdened communities. And the legislature definitely wants to hear from them, as well as the leadership of CARB. If the phone rings and somebody wants to meet with us, we meet with them. So there's a lot of that. But having said that, at the same time, we're such a big state, and there are so many people who are not aware until it hits the mainstream media. My family, I have a sister and her family in LA. I don't think they knew what CARB was before I came to CARB. And now they all want the jackets. They've seen my jacket. They all want the cool CARB jacket. There's a lot of work to be done, but I'm still learning myself. And so those pictures that you saw of Rodeo, even though I have known the activists from that region for the last couple of years, I had never been there. I had never seen how close people are living to tank farms that explode. Or one picture that I didn't put up there was an impressive picture of when there was a brush fire near the Carquinez Bridge. I didn't know. So we have a lot of work to be done, and that is actually another reason why it is so important that we're able to hire people who have different backgrounds. I have one person on my staff who is an air pollution specialist, but he doesn't have a degree at all. He came to work in the mailroom and worked his way up in the organization before the union rules said that you had to have a science degree. And I am so grateful that he was able to do that, because I don't have anybody else on my team who could do what he does, which is essentially outreach. And I call him my community organizer because he's the guy that I send out. We need to have more of that. And then I will just say, I have 8 people who work for me, but one of our sister agencies, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, they have a public participation office that has 30 people in it. And their agency is much smaller than ours. I think they're maybe 1,000 people, if that. So just like the vision was for me to come in and be the lone wolf, I have a bit of a battle also to make sure that we get the right resources to get out there and build more awareness.
I want to thank you so much for coming. And I know we're winding up on time, but I do want to actually, along that line, is think about educators. So people who are educators, we're starting to do some projects around public health in the high schools and empowering students to think about, in Vallejo, to think about their own community and where they're from and different issues that impact them as children. And I think this should go all the way down, as a former kindergarten teacher, all the way down to elementary school, to teach kids about climate change like Germany is now doing, and environmental justice from that young age, especially for underserved communities, to really be aware of what's impacting them. So I think that would be an area I would love to see more educators on your team that can get out that word, to younger populations around California to really impact social justice for their own lives. So.
That's a really good point. And we do have an environmental education piece, or I don't want to call it a department because it's really just one guy, but my team has been trying to do more and more of that, and sometimes through the groups that we work with. But the person that I mentioned, Jose, he has really embraced the environmental education piece. And so we have had students from Oakland send us letters. We have about 30 letters we just got from a school in Coachella Valley. And he's really committed to environmental education. And so he distributes those letters throughout the agency and asks people to reply to each one. So if anybody is talking to a school, we really do reply to those letters. And then B, since we're talking about education, I also want to encourage anybody who is interested in an internship or a practicum. I actually hired a woman last year who just finished her MPH, and she had done a practicum at OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and I was really lucky to be able to hire her on as soon as she finished her degree and finished her practicum. So we do have opportunities like that too, and not just in my group, but throughout the agency.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of your time and of everybody's time in the room, so I want to end us promptly. But I want to thank you again for coming, for taking the time to fit us into your schedule, traveling to all these different places to talk about the work that you're doing and the work that CARB's doing. I want to thank everyone here, all of our students and community members, for your thoughtful and respectful questions and for engaging with us over the course of this lecture series and with all of our different speakers. And, I appreciate that you are ending on the note of talking about ways to connect in practicums. All of our students do field studies. And if, we've had a lot of different topics covered over the course of our social justice lecture series this fall focused on environmental justice. And I encourage you to kind of think back and remember about the content and the topics and the issues that we've dealt with. It's big and it's broad and it's really, really important. And there are lots of ways that you students in your field studies can connect on these issues. So with one last thank you, I will disclose us or adjourn the meeting for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.